If you feel financially behind, you're not imagining it. That feeling doesn't come from one bad decision. It builds quietly over years, from small moments most people never talk about. It shows up when you hesitate before opening your bank app, when you tell yourself you'll deal with it later, when you compare where you are to where you thought you'd be by now. And the hardest part is this. Most people assume that feeling means they did something wrong. They think they failed. They think they missed their chance. They think they're simply bad with money. But that assumption is the real problem. Because when you believe you're the issue, every solution feels urgent, stressful, and overwhelming. You start jumping from idea to idea. You chase strategies. You look for shortcuts. And somehow, even when you're doing more, things don't feel more stable. This video isn't about fixing everything at once. It's not about catching up fast. And it's not about becoming someone new. It's about understanding why money feels fragile in the first place, and how to change that, step by step, without panic. If you've ever felt like you're behind, late, or quietly worried about the future, this isn't a lecture. It's a reset, a way to finally slow things down enough to see what actually matters. Because before money can grow, before investing makes sense, before plans feel realistic, money has to stop feeling like a threat. And once you understand why it feels that way, the path forward becomes much clearer than most people expect. Let's start there. Most people who feel financially behind didn't get there because they were careless. They got there because they followed advice that was technically correct, but delivered in the wrong order. That distinction matters more than almost anything else in money. From the very beginning, the message most people hear sounds reasonable. Save more, invest early, make your money work for you. Don't let cash sit idle. Start as soon as possible. None of that advice is wrong, but it skips something crucial. It assumes that growth is the first priority, and for most people, it isn't. When you're told to focus on growth before stability, you start building upward without feeling grounded. You invest while still feeling one unexpected expense away from panic. You try to optimize while your foundation is shaky. And when something inevitably goes wrong, a bill, a repair, a setback, the entire system feels fragile. That's when money becomes emotional. You don't just feel disappointed, you feel exposed. You start questioning every decision. You wonder if you should have waited or tried something else, or known better. So you look for another strategy. This is where many people get stuck in a loop. They move from idea to idea, not because they're irresponsible, but because nothing ever feels solid enough to commit to. Every plan feels temporary. Every step forward feels reversible. The problem isn't discipline, and it's not intelligence. It's sequencing. Imagine trying to build a house by focusing on the roof first. You could use the best materials, follow expert advice, and work incredibly hard. But without a stable foundation, nothing ever feels secure. Every storm becomes a threat. Every crack feels catastrophic. Money works the same way. When stability is skipped, progress feels fragile. Growth feels stressful instead of empowering. And even good decisions don't bring peace of mind. This is why so many people say things like, "I'm doing all the right things, but I still feel behind." They are doing the right things, just not in the right order. And the financial world doesn't talk enough about order. It talks about products, returns, tactics, optimization. It rarely talks about the emotional sequence required for money to actually feel safe. So people assume the discomfort is normal. They tell themselves stress is just part of building wealth, that anxiety is the price of progress. It isn't. Stress is usually a signal that something foundational was skipped, and once that happens, everything else becomes harder than it needs to be. Not because money is complicated, but because the system you're operating in doesn't give you room to breathe. Before anything can grow sustainably, there has to be a sense of control. Not control over markets or outcomes, but control over your own reactions, over your ability to handle the unexpected without undoing months or years of effort. That's the part most advice ignores. And until that missing piece is addressed, no amount of saving, investing, or earning more will feel like enough. In the next section, we'll slow this down further and look at why feeling behind is often less about numbers and more about psychology. Because once you understand that, the entire picture starts to change. When people say they feel financially behind, they usually think they're talking about numbers, income, savings, net worth, a milestone they haven't reached yet. But most of the time, that's not what their mind is actually reacting to. It's reacting to uncertainty. It's the feeling that time kept moving, responsibilities increased, expectations shifted, but clarity never arrived. That sense that you've been trying, adjusting, working, yet nothing feels settled or secure. This is important to understand because the feeling of being behind doesn't come from having less than other people. It comes from not knowing where you stand in your own story. When you don't have a clear internal reference point, your brain fills the gap, and it rarely fills it with reassurance. It fills it with comparison, doubt, and imagined timelines. You don't feel behind because you're poor. You feel behind because nothing feels anchored. That's why two people with the same income and the same savings can feel completely different about their situation. One feels calm, the other feels tense and reactive. The difference isn't intelligence, discipline, or effort. It's emotional security. Emotional security comes from knowing that what you have can handle what's coming next, without requiring perfect conditions, without needing everything to go right, without constant monitoring. When that certainty is missing, your nervous system stays slightly activated all the time. Not panicked, just alert, waiting. Every unexpected expense feels like a threat. Every market dip feels personal. Every delay feels permanent. Even progress feels fragile, because you're already anticipating what could undo it. Over time, this creates a quiet form of financial anxiety that's hard to explain. You're not in crisis, you're functioning, you're earning, but you never quite relax. You might notice it in small moments, hesitating before spending money, even on necessities, checking your balance repeatedly without feeling reassured, running mental calculations that never quite settle. This state doesn't come from lack of effort. It comes from living without a system that makes you feel safe. And when safety is missing, behavior changes. A mind under financial stress doesn't want long-term stability. It wants immediate relief. So it looks for actions that feel productive, instead of actions that actually build security. It seeks motion instead of structure, activity instead of clarity. That's how people end up constantly adjusting their plans, switching strategies, starting over. Not because the plan was wrong, but because the discomfort never went away. An anxious system can't sit still long enough for consistency to work. The financial world unintentionally reinforces this. Most advice is framed around urgency. Start now, don't miss out. Act before it's too late. Optimize, accelerate, maximize. Even when the advice is technically correct, the emotional framing creates pressure, and pressure introduces noise. Noise makes it harder to tell the difference between what matters and what merely feels urgent. This is why people who are constantly worried about money often make decisions they later question. Not because they're reckless, but because their nervous system is trying to escape uncertainty. What most people actually need isn't more information. It's fewer decisions, fewer moving parts, fewer things that can go wrong. A sense that their system can absorb mistakes, delays, and surprises without collapsing. That's when money stops feeling like a threat. Once you feel stable, your relationship with money changes. You stop reacting to every headline. You stop second-guessing every decision. You stop feeling like one wrong move could erase years of effort. And here's the part most people misunderstand. Peace of mind usually comes before visible progress, not after it. Calm allows consistency. Consistency allows patience. Patience allows compounding. But when you skip calm and chase growth first, you amplify instability instead. Growth magnifies whatever system it's built on. If the system is shaky, growth increases stress. If the system is stable, growth increases confidence. This is why trying to catch up often makes people feel worse, not better. So when someone says they feel financially behind, what they're really saying is this: I don't feel secure inside my own plan. That isn't a personal failure. It's a structural problem. And structural problems aren't solved with urgency, hacks, or doing more. They're solved by starting in a way that calms the system first, and only then building on top of it. In the next section, we'll talk about that starting point, the part most people skip, the foundation that makes everything else finally feel manageable. Before money can grow, before investing makes sense, and before long-term plans feel realistic, there is a quieter step that almost nobody talks about. It isn't glamorous. It doesn't feel impressive, and it won't give you the immediate sense of progress that people crave. But without it, nothing else truly works. This step isn't about earning more. It isn't about investing smarter. And it isn't about discipline or willpower. It's about creating a system that allows you to stop reacting. Most people start their financial journey while still living in a reactive state. Bills dictate decisions. Surprises derail plans. Emotions drive timing. Money feels like something that happens to them, rather than something they operate intentionally. In that state, even good strategies struggle to take hold. The real starting point, what we'll call step 0, is not growth. It's stability. Not the kind of stability that comes from having a lot of money, but the kind that comes from knowing your system can handle disruption without falling apart. Until that exists, every financial decision carries extra weight. Every choice feels risky. Every setback feels personal. And every plan feels temporary. Step 0 is about changing that dynamic. It's about moving from survival mode into something calmer, something quieter, something sustainable. And the reason this step is so often skipped is because it doesn't look like progress from the outside. You don't see dramatic numbers change. You don't feel a rush. There's no immediate reward. But internally, something important begins to shift. You start to feel less urgency, less pressure, less need to constantly fix things. That shift is not psychological fluff. It's structural. When your financial life can absorb small shocks, a bill, a delay, an unexpected expense, without requiring a complete reset, your nervous system finally relaxes. And once that happens, your decision-making improves almost automatically. This is why step 0 comes before everything else. Think of it as building a buffer between you and uncertainty. Not a buffer made of excess wealth, but one made of predictability. Predictability is underrated. When you know what's coming out of your account, when you know what remains afterward, and when you know that the next few months are survivable, even if nothing goes perfectly, your mind stops scanning for danger. You stop checking balances compulsively. You stop hesitating before every purchase. You stop feeling like one wrong move could undo everything. This doesn't require perfection. It requires margin. Margin is the real goal of step 0. Margin between income and obligations. Margin between expectations and reality. Margin between today and the next problem. Without margin, growth feels like gambling. With margin, growth feels optional, and that changes everything. This is where many people get confused. They assume step 0 is about restriction, about cutting everything, about living uncomfortably until some future milestone is reached. It isn't. Step 0 is not about deprivation. It's about containment. It's about making sure your financial life is small enough to control before trying to make it larger. If your system is already stretched, adding complexity doesn't create freedom. It creates fragility. Investing, optimizing, and scaling only work when the base can support them. This is why people who rush into investing often feel more stressed afterward, not less. They added exposure before they added stability. Step 0 reverses that order. It asks one simple question. If nothing improved for the next few months, would I still be okay? Not comfortable, not thriving, just okay. If the honest answer is no, then growth is premature. Not because you're incapable, but because the system isn't ready yet. This is a hard truth, but also a relieving one, because it reframes the problem. You're not behind because you didn't invest earlier. You're behind because you were never given permission to stabilize first. Once you understand that, the pressure lifts. Step 0 doesn't demand speed. It doesn't demand confidence. It doesn't even demand optimism. It only demands honesty. Honesty about what your system can currently handle. Honesty about where stress is coming from. Honesty about what's actually within your control. From there, the goal is simple. Reduce fragility before pursuing growth. That might mean simplifying obligations. It might mean increasing predictability. It might mean temporarily prioritizing cash over returns. None of these choices are permanent. They are preparatory. And preparation is not failure. It's strategy. Once step 0 is in place, something subtle but powerful happens. Money decisions stop feeling like tests you might fail. They start feeling like options you can choose.
You gain time. You gain clarity. You gain the ability to wait. And waiting, when done from a position of stability, is not passivity. It's strength. This is the moment where most people realize they weren't actually behind. They were just trying to move forward while standing on unstable ground. Step 0 gives you ground to stand on. In the next section, we'll build directly on this foundation. We'll lay out the correct order for building wealth, not as a checklist, but as a sequence that respects how humans actually think, feel, and make decisions over time. Once you see the order clearly, everything that felt confusing before starts to line up, and progress finally begins to feel real.
Once stability exists, once step 0 is in place, the question changes. It's no longer, what should I do first? It becomes, what comes next? And this is where order becomes everything. Most people assume wealth is built by effort, by working harder, earning more, saving more aggressively, or investing earlier. Effort feels like the obvious lever. But effort without order often leads to exhaustion instead of progress. Order determines whether effort compounds or cancels itself out. Think about how people usually approach money once they've decided to get serious. They try to do everything at once: save more, invest, pay off debt, optimize spending, learn markets, improve income, reduce risk, increase returns. Individually, all of those goals make sense, but combined, they create cognitive overload. Too many priorities, too many trade-offs, too many decisions competing for attention. This is why people burn out, not because they lack discipline, but because their system demands constant judgment. Every dollar requires a decision. Every month requires rebalancing. Every change in circumstance forces a reassessment. A system like that is fragile. It depends on motivation staying high and conditions staying favorable. When either slips, the whole structure wobbles. The correct order for building wealth is not designed for perfect behavior. It's designed for real life. Real life includes fatigue, distraction, uncertainty, unexpected expenses, periods of low motivation. A good financial system anticipates these things. It doesn't collapse because you had a bad month. That's what order provides. The right sequence reduces decision-making at the beginning, when you're most vulnerable to stress. It delays complexity until your system can support it. And it aligns each step with how confidence naturally grows over time. This is the mistake most advice makes. It starts with the end goal. It talks about portfolios, returns, freedom, and long-term outcomes, before the person listening feels capable of sustaining a plan at all. That gap creates tension. People feel pressured to act before they feel ready. The correct order does the opposite. It starts with what your nervous system needs first. Then it moves to what your behavior can sustain. Only then does it introduce optimization. This is why two people can follow the same advice and get wildly different results. One has the foundation to support it, the other doesn't. Order determines whether advice lands or slides off. So before we list steps, it's important to understand the principle behind them. Each stage of wealth building must earn the right to move to the next. You don't skip stages because you're impatient. You don't combine stages because you're ambitious. And you don't rush stages because you feel behind. Every stage solves a specific problem. If that problem isn't solved, moving forward just carries it with you. In this section, we're going to walk through the correct order slowly and deliberately, not as a checklist, but as a progression, where each step reduces friction and increases capacity for the next one. By the end, you won't just know what to do. You'll understand why doing it in this order changes how everything feels. The first step after stability is not investing. It's not growth, and it's not optimization. It's control. And that's where we'll go next.
Control is the most underestimated phase of wealth building. Most people think control means restriction, cutting spending, saying no, living smaller. That's why they resist it. It feels like punishment for past mistakes. like a downgrade in lifestyle or identity. But real control has nothing to do with deprivation. Control means predictability. It means knowing, with quiet certainty, where your money goes, why it goes there, and what it's doing for you while you're not thinking about it. Without control, growth is unstable. Any progress you make can be reversed by a single unexpected event: a repair, a job change, a medical bill, a market dip that scares you into bad decisions. Control removes panic from the equation. This is why growth-focused advice fails people who feel behind. Growth amplifies whatever system already exists. If your system is chaotic, growth magnifies chaos. So the next step after stability is not more, it's clarity. At this stage, the goal is simple. You should be able to answer 3 questions without stress or guesswork. How much money do I reliably have left each month? What is that money doing by default? What would happen if something went wrong? Most people can't answer those questions, not because they're irresponsible, but because their finances evolved organically, not intentionally. Decisions piled on top of each other without a unifying structure. Control is where structure begins. This doesn't require complex spreadsheets or micromanagement. In fact, overtracking often backfires. The goal isn't to monitor every dollar, it's to remove unnecessary decisions. Control comes from automation and simplicity. A controlled system has fixed, predictable outflows, a clear surplus, default behaviors that work even when attention is elsewhere. This is where you begin separating lifestyle money from progress money. Lifestyle money is allowed to fluctuate within limits. Progress money is protected. Once that separation exists, everything changes psychologically. You stop feeling like every expense is stealing from your future. You stop resenting saving. You stop feeling guilty for enjoying money. Because progress is no longer accidental, it's scheduled. This is also where emotional stability increases. You're no longer reacting to your bank balance. You're operating from a plan that absorbs noise. And here's the key insight most people miss. Control increases confidence before it increases net worth. You may not feel richer yet, but you feel steadier, less reactive, less anxious. That steadiness is what allows future steps to stick. Skipping control leads to a fragile system where investing feels stressful, saving feels restrictive, growth feels risky, and setbacks feel catastrophic. With control in place, those same actions feel neutral, even boring. That boredom is a feature, not a flaw. Boring systems survive. So at this stage, success is not measured by returns. It's measured by how little mental energy your finances require. When money stops demanding constant attention, you've earned the right to move forward. Because the next phase introduces growth, and growth only works when the system underneath it is calm.
Growth is where most people want to start. It's the exciting part, the visible part, the part that feels like progress, investing, returns, compounding, watching numbers move upward. But growth only works when behavior is already stable. This is the mistake that traps people in cycles of starting and stopping. They invest before their system is ready to support consistency. When volatility appears, emotional or financial, they pull back, pause, or abandon the plan entirely. Growth punishes inconsistency. That's why the correct order waits. By the time you reach this stage, something important should already be true. Your progress happens without daily effort.
You are not relying on motivation. You are not negotiating with yourself every month. You are not deciding whether to move money, only how much. This is when growth can begin. At this point, investing stops feeling like a gamble and starts feeling like maintenance. Something you do because it's scheduled, not because you're excited or scared. And this is where compounding actually becomes real. Most people understand compounding intellectually. They've seen the charts, they've heard the examples. But emotionally, compounding only works when the system is quiet enough to let time pass. The biggest threat to compounding is not low returns, it's interruption. Interruptions come from panic during downturns, pausing contributions during uncertainty, reallocating constantly in search of better options, reacting to headlines instead of following a plan. A behaviorally stable system prevents those interruptions. This is why simple, broad strategies outperform complex ones for most people. Not because they're mathematically superior, but because they're easier to stick with. At this stage, growth should be automatic, diversified, boring, long-term. Anything that requires frequent decisions reintroduces friction, and friction erodes consistency. Another key shift happens here. You stop measuring progress monthly. Short-term movement becomes background noise. Up months, down months. None of it changes behavior. The plan runs regardless. That emotional neutrality is what allows scale. Because once growth is stable, increases become easy. Contributions rise naturally with income. Allocations remain steady. Time does the heavy lifting. This is also when patience stops feeling forced. Earlier, patience felt like waiting. Now it feels like allowing. You're no longer desperate for immediate results because the system is clearly working, even if the numbers haven't caught up yet. And that's the subtle but powerful distinction. When behavior is stable, confidence comes before wealth. You know where this is going, because nothing is pulling it off course. So growth, in the correct order, is not aggressive. It's restrained. It's repetitive. It's almost dull. But that dullness is what creates momentum. And once momentum exists, optimization finally becomes safe. Not because optimization is necessary, but because it no longer threatens the system. That's the final stage.
Optimization is where most people get seduced, and where many quietly sabotage themselves. On the surface, optimization sounds intelligent. Smarter allocations, better strategies, lower fees, higher returns, tax efficiency, advanced tools, fine-tuning. All of it sounds like maturity. But optimization done too early doesn't improve outcomes, it destabilizes them. This is why the correct order places optimization last, not because it's unimportant, but because it's dangerous when introduced before momentum exists. Momentum is the key requirement here. Momentum means your system runs without emotional input. Contributions happen automatically. Behavior doesn't change when conditions change. Growth continues even when you're distracted. Without momentum, optimization becomes a form of procrastination disguised as intelligence. People tweak instead of commit. They research instead of execute. They adjust instead of letting time work. And every adjustment resets compounding. Optimization introduces choice. Choice reintroduces decision fatigue. Decision fatigue reintroduces inconsistency. That's the chain most people don't see. In a mature system, optimization happens slowly
and infrequently. It's deliberate, not reactive. It improves efficiency without changing behavior. In an immature system, optimization becomes constant. Every new idea feels urgent. Every alternative feels tempting. The system never gets a chance to settle. This is why advanced strategies should only be layered on once your baseline plan has proven it can survive time, boredom, and volatility. At this stage, when momentum exists, optimization becomes safe. Not because it guarantees better returns, but because mistakes won't derail the entire system. The foundation is strong enough to absorb them. And here's the most important reframe. Optimization is not how wealth is built. Optimization is how wealth is protected once it exists. The biggest gains don't come from smarter tactics. They come from longer exposure. Time in the system beats intelligence inside the system. This is why the order matters so much. Stability protects behavior. Control protects consistency. Growth builds momentum. Optimization refines efficiency. Reverse that order, and everything feels fragile. Follow it, and everything feels calm. This is also where confidence quietly transforms. You stop chasing validation through financial choices. You stop needing to feel smart about money. Because you don't need cleverness anymore. The system works. And when a system works, restraint becomes easier than action. That's when wealth stops feeling aspirational and starts feeling inevitable. There's one final piece to this section, the emotional shift that happens when the order is respected. The moment when money stops being a source of pressure and becomes a background tool. That's what we'll close with.
When the correct order is followed, something subtle happens. It's not dramatic. It doesn't show up in charts. And it's not something most people talk about. But it's the moment when wealth building stops feeling like effort. This is the emotional shift that makes everything stick. Earlier in the process, money carries weight. Every decision feels loaded. Spending feels risky. Saving feels restrictive. Investing feels uncertain. Progress feels fragile, like it could be undone at any moment. That tension is exhausting. But when stability, control, growth, and momentum are layered in the right sequence, the emotional charge drains away. Money becomes quieter, not because you suddenly have a lot of it, but because your system no longer depends on constant vigilance. You're no longer holding everything together mentally. The plan runs. That quiet is the real payoff. This is the stage where people stop obsessively checking balances, where market fluctuations feel distant, where financial news becomes optional instead of triggering. And this is why the order matters more than speed. Rushing skips the emotional adaptation phase. People try to think their way into calm without building the system that creates it. But calm isn't a mindset. It's a consequence. You don't convince yourself to feel secure. You structure your life so insecurity has nothing to attach to. This is also where identity shifts. You stop seeing yourself as someone trying to get ahead. You stop labeling yourself as behind, late, or recovering. You simply become someone whose finances are handled. That identity change alters behavior automatically. Handled finances don't invite impulsive decisions. Handled finances don't chase trends. Handled finances don't require reassurance. They just continue. This is why so many people who reach this point appear boring from the outside. Their lives don't revolve around money conversations. They don't announce milestones. They don't dramatize decisions. Because nothing feels urgent anymore. Urgency is a sign of fragility. When urgency disappears, time expands. And time
is the true advantage. This is the final trap people fall into, thinking wealth is built by intensity. In reality, wealth is built by durability. Durable systems survive boredom. Durable systems survive mistakes. Durable systems survive long stretches of nothing happening. And that's what the correct order creates. It doesn't make you rich overnight. It makes you unstoppable over decades. That's why people who respect the order eventually surpass those who rush. Not because they're smarter, but because they last. If there's one thing to remember from this entire section, it's this. You don't build wealth by doing more. You build wealth by arranging things so less is required of you over time. The correct order reduces effort as progress increases. The wrong order demands more effort just to stand still. Follow the order, and money fades into the background, where it belongs. And when money fades, life opens up. That's the quiet finish line most people never see. Not because it's hidden, but because they never slow down enough to reach it.
Feeling financially behind is one of the most powerful emotional distortions people carry, and one of the least examined. It feels factual. It feels obvious. It feels measurable. But in reality, behind is not a financial condition. It's a psychological interpretation created by comparison, incomplete information, and unrealistic timelines. Most people assume their feeling of being behind comes from math, from numbers, from missed opportunities, from starting too late. But the truth is more uncomfortable and more freeing. The feeling of being behind usually has very little to do with where you actually are. It comes from where you think you should be. That should is rarely self-generated. It's inherited from cultural narratives, highlight reels, selective success stories, and quiet assumptions about what adulthood is supposed to look like. By the time someone reaches their 30s, 40s, or 50s, they're no longer comparing themselves to their past. They're comparing themselves to an imagined benchmark that was never clearly defined in the first place. And that benchmark keeps moving. This is why even people who are objectively doing well still feel behind. They earn more, save more, invest more, yet the pressure never fully lifts. Because the reference point isn't stability or sufficiency, it's relative position. Behind compared to whom? Behind compared to what timeline? Behind based on which version of success? Those questions are almost never answered, yet the emotional weight is carried daily. Here's the distortion most people miss. When you measure yourself against an idealized financial narrative, progress feels invisible. Saving feels small. Consistency feels slow. Stability feels unimpressive. Because the comparison is not grounded in reality, it's grounded in outcomes without context. You see end states without seeing starting points. You see peaks without valleys. You see snapshots without timelines. That's how behind becomes permanent. The mind doesn't register improvement, only distance. This is also why advice aimed at catching up often makes things worse. It reinforces the idea that there is a race, a deadline, and a correct pace, and that you've failed to meet it. That pressure leads to urgency. Urgency leads to risk. Risk leads to fragility. And fragility keeps people stuck. The correct approach does the opposite. It removes the race entirely. Not by pretending time doesn't matter, but by redefining what progress actually is. Progress is not where you rank. Progress is whether your system is moving forward without requiring force. A person with a calm, durable system who started late is in a stronger position than someone with a chaotic, fragile system who started early. Time only compounds what already exists. This is why many people who started ahead quietly fall behind later, not because they made bad choices, but because their systems were never built to survive disruption. Feeling behind also distorts decision-making. When someone believes they're late, they're more likely to overestimate the need for speed, underestimate the value of consistency, tolerate risk they wouldn't otherwise accept, abandon plans too early if results aren't immediate. Behind creates pressure. Pressure creates shortcuts. Shortcuts create instability. This is how people lose years chasing momentum instead of building it. The alternative is slower, but far more reliable. It starts by replacing the idea of catching up with the idea of establishing inevitability. Inevitability doesn't depend on where you are today. It depends on whether your system is aligned with time. If your actions compound and your behavior is stable, outcomes become predictable, even if they're delayed. That's why people who stop feeling behind often describe a strange experience. Nothing dramatic changes at first, but anxiety fades. The numbers may not move quickly, but the pressure does. And when pressure disappears, better decisions follow naturally. This is also why the correct order feels emotionally relieving before it feels financially rewarding. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop needing proof. You stop reacting to comparison. Because you're no longer asking, am I ahead or behind? You're asking, is my system working? That question is grounded. It's answerable. And it doesn't change based on someone else's life. When that shift happens, patience stops feeling like sacrifice. It feels like alignment. And alignment is what allows time to finally work with you instead of against you. Feeling behind is not a signal to rush. It's a signal that your reference point is broken. Fix the reference point, and the urgency dissolves. Dissolve the urgency, and the system stabilizes. Stabilize the system, and progress becomes inevitable. That's the real correction most people never make. Not because it's complicated, but because it requires letting go of a story they've been telling themselves for years. A story that says you're late. A story that says you missed your chance. A story that says speed is the solution. It isn't. Structure is. One of the most damaging questions people carry, often without realizing it, is this: how much is enough? It sounds simple, practical even, but for most people, this question has no answer. And that's exactly why anxiety never leaves. Without a clear definition of enough, progress feels meaningless. No matter how much improves, the finish line keeps moving. Savings increase, income grows, investments compound. Yet the sense of relief never fully arrives, because the goal was never defined. Most people assume enough will reveal itself automatically, that one day they'll look at their accounts and suddenly feel secure. But security doesn't emerge from numbers alone. It emerges from clarity. And clarity is something most people never deliberately create. Instead, they borrow definitions from the world around them, from headlines, from peers, from social media, from stories about early retirement,
luxury lifestyles, or extreme outcomes that were never meant to be universal. The result is a distorted benchmark. Enough becomes vague, inflated, and emotionally loaded. It's no longer about sufficiency. It's about comparison. And comparison has no ceiling. This is why people with vastly different financial situations can feel equally anxious. A person with $10,000 saved can feel behind. A person with $100,000 can feel behind. Even people with far more can still feel like they're falling short. The problem isn't the amount. It's that enough was never anchored to reality. So let's correct that. Enough is not a lifestyle. Enough is not a number pulled from someone else's outcome. Enough is not wealth. Enough is the point at which money stops creating daily pressure. That's it. Enough is the moment when basic needs are covered without stress. Short-term disruptions don't cause panic. Decisions stop feeling urgent, and the future feels predictable rather than threatening. Notice what's missing from that definition. There's no mention of luxury, no mention of status, no mention of early retirement or extreme freedom. Enough is about stability, not aspiration. This distinction matters because when people confuse enough with rich, they sabotage their own peace. They chase outcomes that were never necessary to begin with. Security does not require excess. Security requires margin. Margin means time to respond, room for error, space to think clearly. Once margin exists, anxiety drops sharply, even if net worth isn't impressive. This is why the enough number is usually far lower than people expect. Not because people don't want more, but because their nervous system doesn't need more to calm down. What it needs is predictability. Predictability is what ends financial stress. When income, expenses, and reserves are aligned, the mind relaxes. The constant scanning for threats stops. The urge to optimize every decision fades. This is why clarity around enough is so powerful. It turns money from an emotional problem into a logistical one. Instead of asking, "How do I get more as fast as possible?" you start asking, "What do I need to remove pressure?" That shift changes everything. Pressure reduction is achievable much earlier than wealth accumulation. And once pressure is gone, progress becomes sustainable.
This is also where many people realize something uncomfortable but liberating. They were chasing relief, not money. Money just felt like the only path to get there. But relief doesn't come from growth alone. It comes from knowing when growth is optional instead of necessary. That's what enough provides. Enough gives you permission to slow down without fear. Enough allows patience without anxiety. Enough lets time work instead of feeling wasted. Without that clarity, even good systems feel insufficient. Every market dip feels personal. Every delay feels dangerous. Every pause feels like failure. With clarity, those same events feel neutral. Because you know the system doesn't need perfection to work. Another reason people struggle with enough is that they try to define it emotionally instead of structurally. They wait for a feeling, safety, confidence, peace, to appear before declaring they've reached it. But feelings fluctuate. Structure doesn't. Enough should be defined structurally. How many months of expenses remove short-term panic? What level of cash flow stability prevents constant adjustment? What margin allows mistakes without lasting damage? Those questions are concrete,
answerable, personal. They don't depend on markets, opinions, or comparison. Once those thresholds are crossed, stress drops dramatically, even if ambition remains. And ambition can remain. Wanting more is not a problem. The problem is needing more to feel okay. When more is optional, ambition becomes healthy. It's no longer driven by fear or comparison. It becomes curiosity, growth, and preference, not desperation. This is the difference between expansion and escape. People who haven't defined enough are trying to escape discomfort. People who have defined it are expanding from stability. That's why clarity ends anxiety faster than growth ever could. It also explains why so many people feel calmer after organizing their finances, even before the numbers change. The structure alone creates relief, because uncertainty is more stressful than scarcity. Knowing where you stand, even if it's not ideal, is easier on the nervous system than constantly guessing. This is also why enough must be revisited periodically, but not constantly. Enough should be stable, not reactive. It doesn't change with market cycles. It doesn't change because someone else upgraded their lifestyle. It doesn't change because of short-term noise. Enough changes only when life changes in meaningful ways. Responsibilities, health, dependence, priorities. And when it does, it's adjusted deliberately, not emotionally. This is the point in the process where people finally stop asking, "Am I doing okay?" Because they already know the answer. They may not be finished, they may still want more, but the pressure is gone. And once pressure disappears, wealth building becomes surprisingly simple. Not fast, not flashy, but calm, consistent, and resilient. That's why defining enough is not a luxury step. It's a foundational one. Without it, even success feels unstable. With it, even modest progress feels meaningful. And that's the moment money stops being the central character in your life and becomes what it was always meant to be, a tool that supports clarity, not a source of constant evaluation.
Few beliefs are as paralyzing or as unnecessary as the idea that you've started too late. It arrives quietly at first, a thought you don't fully examine. Then it hardens into a conclusion. Then it shapes every decision you make. I'm behind. I missed the window. If I had started earlier, this would all be easier. These thoughts feel rational. They feel supported by math, by timelines, by stories of people who started young and are now far ahead. But they rest on a flawed understanding of how time actually works in real financial lives. The panic around age doesn't come from math. It comes from linear thinking applied to a non-linear process. Most people imagine wealth as something that grows steadily over time, a smooth, upward slope that rewards early starters and punishes late ones. In that mental model, starting late means you can never catch up. But real financial trajectories don't look like lines. They look like curves, and curves behave very differently. In real life, most people's early years contribute almost nothing to their eventual outcome. Income is low, stability is fragile, knowledge is incomplete, consistency is rare. What looks like an early start is often a long period of preparation, not compounding. This is why so many people who technically started young still end up stuck. They confuse time passing with progress happening. Time only helps once behavior stabilizes. Before that, years can go by with very little net effect.
This is the first illusion age anxiety creates. It assumes all years are equal. They're not. A stable year at 45 can be more productive than 10 unstable years at 25. Why? Because the inputs are different. Later years often come with higher earning power, clearer priorities, better emotional regulation, more consistent behavior. Those factors matter more than raw time alone. This is why many people see their biggest financial acceleration in their 40s, 50s, and even later. Not because they suddenly discovered a secret, but because the system finally became stable enough to compound. Another misconception is that starting late requires extreme action to make up for lost time. That belief fuels risk-taking, over-optimization, and burnout. But catching up is the wrong frame entirely. You're not racing a younger version of yourself. You're building a system for the years you actually have. And the years you have are usually more than enough. The idea that only early starters succeed comes from survivorship bias. We hear about people who started at 20 and ended wealthy, but we don't hear about the countless early starters whose behavior never stabilized, whose plans changed constantly, or whose lives interrupted their progress. What we rarely hear are the stories of late starters who quietly built durable systems and surpassed expectations, because those stories don't fit the dramatic narrative. They're calm, gradual, unremarkable on the surface, but they work. This brings us to the most important correction about age. Time is not the same as effective exposure. Effective exposure is the period during which contributions are consistent, behavior is steady, decisions are not reactive, and the system is left alone long enough to work.
For many people, effective exposure doesn't begin until later in life, regardless of when they started. So the real question isn't, how old are you? It's, how stable is your system right now? If your system is stable today, time is finally on your side, regardless of age. This is why panic around starting late is so destructive. It pushes people to abandon stability in favor of urgency. Urgency feels productive. It feels decisive. It feels like action. But urgency shortens time horizons. It encourages shortcuts. It increases emotional volatility. And it undermines the very consistency that makes time useful. Ironically, panic about being late often wastes the time you do have. The correct response to starting later is not intensity, it's precision. Precision means fewer moving parts, fewer decisions, fewer changes, more consistency. Precision increases the efficiency of every year ahead. This is also where people misunderstand compounding. Compounding is not magic. It doesn't reward early starters automatically. It rewards uninterrupted systems. A person who compounds steadily for 20 years often ends up in a stronger position than someone who compounds inconsistently for 30. Consistency beats duration. Another hidden advantage of starting later is psychological. You are less likely to be seduced by novelty, less likely to chase trends, less likely to gamble on unproven ideas, less likely to mistake excitement for progress. You've lived long enough to know that most opportunities fade quickly. That restraint protects your timeline. It allows you to focus on what works repeatedly instead of what works briefly. This is why the calm approach is especially powerful
for people who feel late. It removes the need to force outcomes. Instead of asking, "How do I compress time?" you ask, "How do I stop leaking it?" Stopping leaks often produces faster results than increasing speed. Leaks include lifestyle inflation without intention, constant strategy changes, emotional reactions to short-term noise, delaying action due to overthinking. When leaks are sealed, progress accelerates naturally. This is also why age-based comparisons are meaningless. Comparing yourself to someone younger assumes identical starting conditions, identical life paths, and identical constraints. That's never true. The only comparison that matters is internal. Is your system more stable this year than last year? If the answer is yes, time is now compounding for you. And that's the shift that dissolves panic. Late starters don't need extraordinary returns. They need ordinary returns applied consistently. The math supports this far more than people realize. But more importantly, the psychology supports it. Once urgency fades, behavior improves. Once behavior improves, outcomes follow. This is why so many people report feeling better about money before seeing dramatic numerical change. The system is finally aligned with time instead of fighting it. Age anxiety tells you that you're racing a clock, but the clock isn't your enemy. Instability is. Fix instability, and time becomes neutral, even generous. And here's the final reframe that matters most. You don't need to win the earliest part of the game to win the part that matters. Most of the meaningful compounding happens later anyway, when contributions are larger, behavior is refined, and decisions are less emotional. Starting late doesn't disqualify you. Starting unstable does. Once stability is established, every year ahead becomes highly productive, regardless of when you arrived. That's why the calm plan works. It doesn't argue with time, it aligns with it. And alignment always outperforms panic.
One of the most dangerous moments in any financial journey comes quietly. It happens after you've done the right things, but before the numbers reflect it. You've organized your finances. You've put a structure in place. You've started acting in the correct order. And yet, the bank balance hasn't changed much. This is where many people give up. Not because the plan is wrong, but because they're watching the wrong signals. Money is a lagging indicator. It always is. The problem is that most people expect money to change first. They believe the numbers should reward them immediately for better behavior. When that doesn't happen, doubt creeps in. Is this working? Did I start too late? Shouldn't I be further ahead by now? Those questions feel logical, but they're misplaced. Because the first real changes in a stable financial system are not financial. They're psychological. And if you know what to look for, they're impossible to miss. The very first thing that changes is mental noise. Before structure, money lives in the background of your thoughts. Not always consciously, but persistently. A low-level hum of concern that never fully shuts off. You're not constantly panicking. You're just never fully relaxed. Once the system is in place, that noise begins to fade, not disappear, but soften. You stop replaying decisions in your head. You stop checking balances compulsively. You stop mentally forecasting worst-case scenarios every time you spend. This isn't optimism. It's reduced uncertainty. The mind relaxes when it knows what happens next. That calm alone
is a massive win, and it arrives long before wealth does. The second thing that changes is decision quality. When finances are chaotic, every decision feels loaded. Spending feels risky. Saving feels restrictive. Investing feels intimidating. Everything carries emotional weight. Structure removes that weight. Decisions stop feeling like moral judgments. They become mechanical. You're no longer asking, "Is this the right choice?" You're asking, "Does this fit the plan?" That subtle shift dramatically improves consistency. Good decisions stop requiring willpower. Bad decisions stop tempting you as much. Because the system already answered most questions in advance. This is why people often report feeling more mature around money before they feel richer. Not because they've changed as people, but because the system is doing more of the work. The third thing that changes is sleep. This one surprises people. They don't expect money organization to affect sleep, but it does. Financial uncertainty keeps the nervous system alert. It signals threat, even when nothing immediate is wrong. When uncertainty drops, the body responds. People sleep deeper. They wake up less anxious. They stop replaying numbers at night. Sleep improves before net worth does. And better sleep improves everything else: patience, impulse control, long-term thinking. This is one of the reasons progress accelerates later. Early psychological wins create better conditions for future behavior. The fourth thing that changes is confidence, but not the loud kind. Not bravado. Not optimism. Not "I've got this" energy. Quiet confidence. The kind that doesn't need reassurance. You stop seeking confirmation that you're doing the right thing. You stop bouncing between advice sources. You stop second-guessing yourself every time you hear a new opinion. Because the plan is clear. Clarity creates confidence far more reliably than success does. This is why people often say, "I finally feel in control," even when the numbers are still modest. Control isn't about size. It's about predictability. The fifth thing that changes is how you relate to time. Before, time feels heavy, like something slipping away. Every year that passes feels like a missed opportunity. After structure, time feels neutral again. You stop obsessing over how long things will take. You stop counting months. You stop measuring progress in short bursts. Because the system no longer depends on urgency. This is a massive psychological relief, and it's one of the clearest signs you're on the right path. When impatience fades, consistency becomes effortless. The sixth thing that changes is how you respond to setbacks. Before, any unexpected expense feels like failure, a disruption, proof that things aren't working. After, setbacks feel absorbed, not because they don't matter, but because they don't threaten the system. A repair doesn't derail progress. A bad month doesn't undo everything. A delay doesn't trigger panic, because margin exists. This is the moment people stop saying, "I can't afford that," and start saying, "That doesn't break the plan." That distinction is enormous. It marks the transition from fragility to resilience. The seventh thing that changes is self-trust. This one is subtle but profound. When finances are unstable, people stop trusting themselves. They believe they're bad with money, that they'll mess things up, that they need constant guidance. Once the system proves it can run without drama, that belief fades. You start trusting your ability to follow through, not because you're perfect, but because the system doesn't require perfection. This restores agency. You're no longer trying to fix yourself. You're working with who you actually are. And systems built around real behavior last. The eighth thing that changes is your relationship to more. Before, more feels urgent. necessary, like the solution to everything. After, more becomes optional. You may still want it, but you don't need it to feel okay. This is where ambition becomes healthier. It's no longer driven by fear. It's driven by preference. That shift alone reduces self-sabotage. People make better long-term decisions when they're not trying to escape discomfort. The ninth thing that changes is how you consume information. Financial news stops feeling personal. Market movements stop feeling like commentary on your life. Advice stops feeling urgent. You become selective. You stop chasing every new idea because you're no longer searching for reassurance. This protects your system. It prevents constant adjustment, which is one of the biggest killers of long-term progress. The 10th thing that changes, and this is the most important, is identity. You stop thinking of yourself as someone trying to get better with money. You become someone whose money is handled. That identity shift is what makes everything durable. Handled systems don't require motivation. Handled systems don't need constant improvement. Handled systems just run. And once a system is handled, numbers eventually follow. This is why people who stay the course often look calm before they look wealthy. The calm came first. The numbers are catching up. If you're early in this process and nothing dramatic has happened yet, that's not a sign of failure. It's a sign you're looking at the wrong metrics. Watch for reduced stress, clearer decisions, improved sleep, less urgency, more patience. Those are the real indicators. Money will move, but it moves last. And when it does, it moves faster than you expect, because the system beneath it is finally strong enough to support it. This is the part of the journey most people never make it through, not because it's hard, but because it's quiet. And quiet progress is easy to abandon if you don't recognize it. Now you know what to look for.
At some point in every long journey, a quiet realization appears. Not excitement, not relief, certainty. It's the moment when you stop asking whether this will work and start understanding that it will, unless you actively interfere. That's what the long game really is. Not patience, not discipline, not belief. Non-interruption. Most people think wealth is hard because it requires extraordinary effort over a long period of time. That belief makes the whole process feel intimidating, even unrealistic. But the truth is simpler and far less dramatic. Wealth is hard because people keep stopping. They interrupt the process. They change direction too often. They react emotionally. They abandon plans before time can do its job. The long game only fails when it's broken. And once you see that clearly, everything shifts. The goal stops being acceleration. It becomes continuity. Continuity is what turns ordinary actions into extraordinary outcomes. This is why people often misunderstand compounding. They imagine it as a mathematical phenomenon, something that happens because of returns. But compounding is first a behavioral phenomenon. It's what happens when actions repeat without friction. The math only reflects what behavior made possible. When behavior is stable, results become inevitable, not because returns are high, but because the process is uninterrupted. This is the part most people never fully internalize. They treat time as something to conquer instead of something to cooperate with. They try to outsmart it, compress it, or rush past it. But time only rewards alignment, and alignment looks boring. Boring systems don't generate stories. They don't create dramatic turning points. They don't feel impressive in the moment. But they accumulate power quietly. This is why people underestimate the long game. It doesn't announce itself. You don't feel rich
while it's working. You don't feel successful early on. You mostly feel steady. And steadiness doesn't feel like progress in a culture obsessed with momentum. But steadiness is exactly what makes progress unstoppable. This is where inevitability comes from. Not confidence, not optimism, not motivation, but repetition without resistance. The moment your system no longer fights you and you no longer fight it, time takes over. That's the real handoff. From effort to momentum, from control to automation, from intention to inevitability. At that point, outcomes are no longer dependent on how you feel. They're dependent on whether you interfere. And interference is the only real threat. Interference comes in many forms: chasing better strategies, reacting to short-term noise, comparing your timeline to someone else's, abandoning boring consistency for exciting change, pausing progress because results feel slow. None of those actions feel destructive in the moment. They feel reasonable. That's why they're dangerous. Each interruption resets momentum slightly. One interruption doesn't ruin anything, but repeated ones prevent compounding from ever fully engaging. This is why people feel like they've been trying for years without results. They've been active, but not continuous. The long game rewards continuity, not intensity. Another reason the long game works is that life itself becomes more predictable when finances are stable. Earlier, uncertainty in money amplifies uncertainty everywhere else. Decisions feel heavier. Risks feel scarier. Planning feels fragile.
As stability increases, optionality increases. You're no longer optimizing just money, you're optimizing life. Better decisions at work, more patience in relationships, less stress-driven behavior, clearer thinking under pressure. These changes compound too, just not in spreadsheets. They improve income potential, decision quality, and long-term outcomes indirectly. This is why the long game often accelerates later without any obvious catalyst. Nothing dramatic changes. No sudden insight appears. No major risk is taken. The system just keeps running, and time finally has room to work. This is also why people who reach this stage often struggle to explain how they did it. They say things like, "I just stuck to it. I didn't do anything special. It kind of happened slowly." Those answers frustrate people looking for shortcuts, but they're honest. The long game doesn't feel like a breakthrough while you're in it. It feels like maintenance. And maintenance doesn't trigger urgency, which is exactly why it works. Urgency is incompatible with longevity. The moment something feels urgent, it demands change. Change creates friction. Friction invites mistakes. The long game removes urgency entirely. There is no rush because nothing is fragile anymore. This is the point where people stop checking progress obsessively. They know the direction is right. They don't need constant feedback. They stop counting years. They stop forecasting aggressively. They stop imagining worst-case scenarios. Because the system is no longer dependent on ideal conditions. It works in good years. It survives bad years. It continues through boredom. That's inevitability. And here's the most important thing to understand. You don't need to believe in the long game for it to work. Belief helps, confidence helps, but neither is required. You only need to not interrupt it. You can doubt quietly. You can feel impatient sometimes. You can question things occasionally. As long as the system continues, the outcome remains on track. This is why people who stop interfering
eventually surprise themselves. One day they look back and realize that the numbers finally caught up, not because they pushed harder, but because they stopped getting in the way. The long game isn't heroic, it's humble. It doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't require brilliance. It doesn't punish slow starts. It only asks one thing: let time do what it does best. Once that happens, wealth stops being something you chase and becomes something that unfolds, quietly, predictably, inevitably.
As stability increases, optionality increases. You're no longer optimizing just money, you're optimizing life. Better decisions at work, more patience in relationships, less stress-driven behavior, clearer thinking under pressure. These changes compound too, just not in spreadsheets. They improve income potential, decision quality, and long-term outcomes indirectly. This is why the long game often accelerates later without any obvious catalyst. Nothing dramatic changes. No sudden insight appears. No major risk is taken. The system just keeps running, and time finally has room to work. This is also why people who reach this stage often struggle to explain how they did it. They say things like, "I just stuck to it. I didn't do anything special. It kind of happened slowly." Those answers frustrate people looking for shortcuts, but they're honest. The long game doesn't feel like a breakthrough while you're in it. It feels like maintenance. And maintenance doesn't trigger urgency, which is exactly why it works. Urgency is incompatible with longevity. The moment something feels urgent, it demands change. Change creates friction. Friction invites mistakes. The long game removes urgency entirely. There is no rush because nothing is fragile anymore. This is the point where people stop checking progress obsessively. They know the direction is right. They don't need constant feedback. They stop counting years. They stop forecasting aggressively. They stop imagining worst-case scenarios. Because the system is no longer dependent on ideal conditions. It works in good years. It survives bad years. It continues through boredom. That's inevitability. And here's the most important thing to understand. You don't need to believe in the long game for it to work. Belief helps, confidence helps, but neither is required. You only need to not interrupt it. You can doubt quietly. You can feel impatient sometimes. You can question things occasionally. As long as the system continues, the outcome remains on track. This is why people who stop interfering eventually surprise themselves. One day they look back and realize that the numbers finally caught up, not because they pushed harder, but because they stopped getting in the way. The long game isn't heroic, it's humble. It doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't require brilliance. It doesn't punish slow starts. It only asks one thing: let time do what it does best. Once that happens, wealth stops being something you chase and becomes something that unfolds, quietly, predictably, inevitably.